out there and create some more leaders. Thank you.
Hopefully we'll see some of you younger guys that'll be able to come up here as well and get this wonderful medal. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Small College Basketball Podcast. Again, Chris Cottrell here with you today, celebrating the players, the programs, the coaches, and the history of small college basketball. We do need to thank our primary sponsor, Visit Central Florida, for their support of the Small College Basketball Podcast, the Small College Basketball Hall of Fame Classic. So start planning your Central Florida vacation now at visitcentralflorida.com. Pleased today to be back on the pod and to be back in front of you after a brief hiatus. We had a week off due to weather up here in New York, had some games rescheduled, practices rescheduled, hard to coordinate the interviews with all the coaches playing at the same time. But I am happy to welcome our friend Pat Coleman, who's the managing editor of D3Hoops.com today. Lucky to have Pat on. Usually we get him once a season to talk Division III men's basketball and to break down the season about halfway through. Kind of a fun time of year to be looking at what's coming up and then what we've already gone through. So Pat, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me back.
It's really a cool time of year because we start the season, you know, back in October and then November, and now things are really heating up. You're coming off the D3Hoops.com Classic, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But I want to start this conversation with the preseason poll and Christopher Newman, defending national champions, number one. In the 8 polls that we've had since, they've fallen out. They're back in the top 25 as of the most recent poll. So a 2-part question to kick this thing off. Thoughts on Christopher Newport, but then they're jumping around in the poll. What does that say to you about the parity at NCAA Division III?
Well, yeah, there's definitely a significant amount of parity in Division III men's basketball. And I think there always has been a little bit, but, you know, over the course of the past couple of years, you have programs that are able to take advantage of having, you know, grad student transfers, people who have extra years of eligibility over the course of the past few years because of the extra year of COVID eligibility. So you see, I think, you know, the talent just kind of spread out even further than it usually is. Usually you come into a Division III men's basketball season and you can name probably 10 to 12 teams that have a legitimate shot at winning the national title right off the top of the bat. And, you know, right over here over this shoulder, right, where you see the football logo, usually in the Division III football world, you can't come up with more than 2 or 3 teams. So Division III basketball already has that parity. I'd say this about Christopher Newport. I mean, you know, they've had some, let's say, some roster difficulties. Trey Barber, who is the, you know, is their star player, hit the game-winning shot at the buzzer last year for them in that national championship game, was actually suspended from the team for a few games. They, you know, they lost some games that maybe they wouldn't you wouldn't have considered that they would lose. And also, you know, Chris, I mean, they don't have a conference schedule, basically. You know, the C2C, the Coast to Coast Conference, is this kind of bizarre amalgam in Division III where there are a couple of teams in Christopher Newport's area, like Mary Washington, like Salisbury, who have been, you know, traditional rivals for them over the course of the past several years. But then, you know, there are schools in Northern California, and it's just and New York City. It's excuse me, it's just not a real playable schedule. So you are kind of going out and getting games where you could get them, right? And, you know, John Krikorian, especially coming off a national championship season, is like, I want to play Hampton-Sydney. Hampton-Sydney is currently the number 1 team in our poll. And Christopher Newport came out pretty flat at their place on the opening night of the season. Played Randolph-Macon. Randolph-Macon has won a national championship not all that long ago, obviously. Johns Hopkins, one of the greats in Division III men's basketball over the past decade and in previous years as well. Rowan is having a real great season. Virginia Wesleyan has had some good times and has struggled a little bit also, but they've been at their best. They've been very good. They played Emory. Emory plays in the really tough UAA. And then they have Mary Washington in their conference and that sort of thing. It's tough to put together a schedule of 25 teams when you really only have 2 or 3 guaranteed games against members of your conference. So I think that's certainly part of it. It's tough to play in that conference and everybody's gunning for you. And, maybe things haven't been perfect from a chemistry standpoint or from a roster stability standpoint. And, for example, Barber got teed up in that loss to UC Santa Cruz. Sounds like things kind of fell apart for them. And then, he was essentially benched for basically the entire game against Pfeiffer a few days later. Who knows, really? But, Christopher Newport at its best is really good and capable of making a run. But there are a lot of teams in Division III men's basketball you could say the same about this season.
So I want to follow back on 2 things that you mentioned. First, we had John Krikorian on to discuss the national championship and talk about the upcoming season. Their schedule is brutal, as you mentioned. I mean, they open up, I think, on the road at Hampden-Sydney, who, as you mentioned, now is number 1. We're going to get to them in a few minutes. But their schedule was absolutely brutal out of the chute. And not having a conference schedule to fall back on can increase the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to go out and do a lot of work just to find games, and you don't get a rhythm like in basketball, right? I mean, in Division III basketball especially, you have a rhythm of you play Wednesday night, you play Saturday afternoon in a lot of conferences. Sometimes in conferences you also play on a Monday night, or some conferences will play Friday, Saturday, or Friday, Sunday, or Saturday, Sunday, but it's like that for 6, 8 weeks in a row, right? Once you come back from your holiday break in January through the end of the regular season into your conference tournament, you have a pretty predictable schedule. Some days you're at home, some days you're on the road, but it's just not that way when you're playing a schedule the way that Christopher Newport is, and Christopher Newport exact same way in women's basketball. Just trying to find games wherever you can. It is a challenge, and it's hard to get into that groove that maybe you might be able to rely on at 99% of other Division III institutions.
And so we talked about parity, and there is incredible parity at the Division III level at the moment. I tend to think that the transfer portal is having a positive impact on Division II and Division III basketball, and NAIA for that matter, due to the Division I's are taking transfers first. There's very few spots remaining for, elite and high-level high school players. A lot of those players may be falling to a lower level, Division II, Division III. I think the transfer portal has given Division II schools, Division III schools, NAIA schools, I think it's given them a bigger pot to pick from when you look at really good high school athletes. What are your thoughts?
That's interesting. I had not really thought of it that way because I just don't focus on basketball outside of NCAA Division III all that often. What I do see at the D3 level is, in terms of the transfer portal, is first, there's a number of kids who at the D3 level decide that they want to test the waters at the Division I level, and they might get to go do so, and they might get to have a fantastic experience. Someone like Raheem Anthony, who was at St. Mary's of Minnesota, was, an all-world player for them, basically, then transfers to the University of St. Thomas. Now they are Division I. He's making Division III look good at the D1 level for them right now. We had a spate of them, obviously, at the beginning of COVID, guys who went up to the D1 level and contributed on some pretty good teams. And we've had some guys come back. We guys go like from Illinois Wesleyan to North Dakota and then back, right? Right. Yep. It can be a two-way street. So that's interesting. I will want to see that effect continue to trickle down what you described as we, kind of wean ourselves off of these kids with extra fifth-year COVID eligibility, because, maybe if some of those kids do fall to the Division II, Division III level, then, we'll be able to see the effects of it more, more clearly once we don't have these two variables in the
Right.
mix. I was raised by a biochemist and a scientist, so I don't, I'm not good with the two variables. Give me one variable and a control in a couple of years, and we'll see how that turns out. That certainly seems possible.
Well, let's control the basketball. I want to get back to some of the best teams in the country at Division III. We've done a lot of talking on previous pods about the transfer portal, NIL. Those things exist, but let's just get back to what I think the best part of this whole thing is, the basketball. And you mentioned this team earlier. For the fifth week in a row, Hampden-Sydney is the top team in the country. They've won 14 straight. They've got a huge game coming up later today, Saturday, against Randolph-Macon, number 8 team in the country. Where do you see Hampden-Sydney right now? Because they are rolling.
Yeah, they absolutely are. First of all, Hampden-Sydney, under Caleb Kimbrough now, no longer first season there. This is a program that has been kind of waiting, right? They've been waiting to be reignited. Under Tony Shaver, they went to the Division III Final Four. They went all the way to double overtime against fantastic Bo Ryan UW Platteville squad. And then they came back to the Final Four a few years later. And then they really struggled. They had some middling seasons, some, 19 and 11, 17 and 10, 14 and 14. And then the bottom kind of fell out of them a few years ago. So, to get and see this program kind of be back on track, last year, of course, going 14 and 2 in Old Dominion Athletic Conference play, and they lost in the second round, but it was to Christopher Newport, right? I mean, Christopher Newport only won the entire thing. So, that can be kind of excused, and they come out and avenge that loss right away. I think one of the best rivalries in Division III men's basketball is that rivalry between Hampden-Sydney and Randolph-Macon. And it's a fantastic football rivalry as well. It's a rivalry in basically every sport that these two schools get on the field, court, etc., together against each other. So to see that where, this is a game that for Saturday, was already sold out by Tuesday afternoon, right? And Hampden-Sydney seats, maybe about 1,400 people, standing room, who knows? This is a rivalry that in its heyday, like 20 years ago, Chris, the fire marshal had to be called in to determine how many tickets could actually be allocated. And I was at a game at Randolph-Macon where people are hanging all over the rafters, not hanging in the rafters, but there's a stairway, literally a stairway up to kind of this press box observation area that's probably 30 feet above the floor. And there were people sitting on this stairway all the way up and crowded 5 or 6 deep in the corners. Anyway, it's a fantastic rivalry. Division III basketball is great when those two teams are really good, and they are really good this year. So look forward to seeing that. Randolph-Macon kind of struggled out of the gate a little bit this year, maybe fell off the radar just a little bit when they started 1 and 2. They started 5 and 3 with a loss to Hampden-Sydney back in December. I mean, Randolph-Macon is clicking right now too, so that should be a fantastic game.
Yeah, it should be really interesting. They're both top 10 in the country in defensive efficiency. I think Randolph-Macon, Hampden-Sydney both have multiple players, 2, 3, 4, 5 players averaging double figures. Both have depth. Really, a really interesting matchup in the top 10 coming up later today. Along the top 10, John Carroll has also been at the top or near the top for the entirety of the season. How does John Carroll compare to what you've seen so far, maybe with Hampden-Sydney or a Randolph-Macon, a Christopher Newport, some of the teams we've talked about that are at the top? John Carroll certainly has been there as well with Guilford and Calvin, some very good teams.
Yeah, and John Carroll kind of ties into one of the things we were talking about earlier too. It's like this is like a team that coming into last season was really just had its kind of pick of guys out of the transfer portal. A bunch of guys coming to them from Division I, from I think Youngstown, Ohio University, et cetera. They went from 8 and 16 2 years ago to 23 and 5 last year. Those guys now understand what it's like to play basketball in Division III. Guys come to Division III from Division I and expect to just step on the floor and dominate by natural ability. And that is not the case. It has been proven over and over again. And I think even so with John Carroll last year, although those guys went 23 and 5, I mean, That's only 28 games. That's not a very deep run into the NCAA tournament at the D3 level. Obviously, we have a head-to-head game we can point to, right? John Carroll lost at home to Hampton-Sydney on December 19th. Be honest with you, sometimes these games that happen like right before a holiday break, like a Tuesday game right before Thanksgiving seems to be like the most upset worthy day. That Saturday before Christmas, your finals are all done. You're just hanging around for this basketball game, and then you get a few days to go home. That is when strange things happen. Hampton-Sydney kind of went in there and dominated, obviously, but man, that's the only game that John Carroll has lost all season. Davidson Hubbard for Hampton-Sydney had a day where he just couldn't be stopped. He had 31 points. He had 9 rebounds. Man, John Carroll is really good. Luke Frazier is a top-notch talent in that team. And, I think the fact that, you look at them and they are, as of the time that we're talking and going into Saturday's game, they're 13-0 in the Ohio Athletic Conference. And that's with teams like Mount Union, which went deep into the playoffs last year, Marietta, which has been a really tough NCAA tournament team on multiple occasions over the past several years. They've beaten those teams. Otterbein is resurging in that conference. Capital looks pretty good in that conference. The Ohio Athletic Conference is easily a top 10 conference in Division III men's basketball. It's pushed them in the top 25%. And I think most years they're in the top 10%. For them to be unbeaten in conference really says a lot about the quality of those guys and the quality of that program. And, Pete Moran doing what his dad did, at least in terms of winning games at John Carroll, is it doesn't surprise me. That's a really good team.
So as we look at the top 10 teams, top 15 teams in the country, they've all pretty much been at or near the top in the poll. Trinity, Trine, Oswego State having a very good year here in New York. Guilford has been very consistent throughout the course of the season. The top 10 teams are made. There's only one team with 3 losses, and that's Randolph-Macon. So in your eyes, what are some of the other teams to watch, maybe outside of the top 10, that are knocking on the door that could be surging later on in the season now that we're heading into February?
Well, it's awfully convenient for me for the answer to this question that Case Western Reserve dropped out of the top 10 this past week, because they absolutely would be in this conversation. If you and I had recorded this conversation a week earlier, we would have been talking about Case first, maybe before we talked about John Carroll. Case had been
at the very, very top. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so they did lose 2 games last weekend. They play in the UAA, the University Athletic Association. So what happens is your John Carroll, or your Case Western Reserve coming from Cleveland, Ohio, and then you get on a plane to fly to Chicago on Friday, and then a bus to drive down to St. Louis or whatever on Saturday. If you're on a road trip in the UAA, you play somewhere in front of generally a rabid fan base on Friday night, someplace that's really tough to play, and then you go on Saturday and play a second consecutive game on the road in front of almost nobody at like noon on Sunday afternoon. And it's this really difficult thing for teams to do. For teams to go to Chicago and St. Louis and win 2 games is difficult. For teams to go on the trip that is, Rochester, New York, and Atlanta, Georgia, that is your weekend. Some weekends, one weekend every year in the UAA, you've got to play Emory and the University of Rochester, or you go to Boston and New York City to play NYU and Brandeis. Man, that league is tough and is really tough to win on the road. So, Case did not do that. They did not win those 2 games on the road. So they're 15-3 and they are sitting at number 11, but they are very much as much a national title contender as anyone else. They played at our tournament, the D3Hoops.com Classic in Las Vegas over the holidays. Case is a graduate research institution. It's one of America's best research institutions, aside from athletics altogether. There's a bunch of grad students there in general. There's a bunch of grad students playing Division III men's basketball in this program as well. And I think the guy, if I could only talk about one guy, it would be Anthony Mazzio. He is the guard for them. He transferred from Baldwin Wallace, which means, he transferred about 15 miles, had a great career for Baldwin Wallace in the OAC, and has just been fantastic for Case Western Reserve. But they have a number of other guys who, some of them have transferred from Washington and Lee. And I'm sorry, I'm working from memory on this, but I did my roster prep for Case Western Reserve back about 4 weeks ago before our tournament, so I don't have all of that right at the tip of my brain. But they're another program that has really benefited from the transfer portal, and probably will continue to do so if there's grad eligibility available. They bring in a bunch of kids. NYU has brought in a bunch of kids in that conference as well. Case Western Reserve is where I start. Calvin also has some fantastic, individual talent. Jalen Overway, everybody talks about. He is the real deal. And I would say, UW Platteville is someone worth keeping an eye on. Whoever wins the WIAC, the conference of, UW schools in Division III, is always going to be a challenge. A tough out in the tournament. And that's just teams outside the top 10. There's obviously a bunch of teams in the top 10 who are national title contenders as well.
One of the teams inside of the top 10 that I want to hit on, because we're in the area, and I think they have two elite players. I think right now they are currently number 7, but Keene State with Jeff Hunter, who's averaging a double-double, Octavio Brito, an elite guard. What do you think of Keene State? I've been able to watch them. We interviewed them. They played in the Champions Classic, so
Right.
have some familiarity. But I think that's a team outside of the top 5 that's still in the conversation for national championships.
Well, I think so too. I think one of the great things about Keene State is they haven't really missed a beat, right? Ryan Kane, who kind of rebuilt that program, which was prominent in the 90s and for a time in the aughts, and then came back to the pack a little bit. And then Ryan Kane leaves for Johns Hopkins, which is, it's a fantastic job. You have to take that if that is available to you. I think David Hastings has done a great job at Keene State. Keene is also a tough place to play. They play in this cinder block kind of 1950s building that is just, it gets so loud, and the local community comes out to support them. They're a big deal in the town of Keene, New Hampshire. So just, all of those things first off, right? You had the ability to see them. You guys saw them obviously at the tournament out in South Dakota. Interesting to see, the losses, the losses won at that tournament. When a Stockton kid had just an amazing individual effort, right? I remember watching that game from the sidelines at another tournament that I was at that weekend. And of course they lost to Tufts, and they beat Middlebury, who's kind of up and down this year. Keene State, always the question is, once you get out of that area, you're going to play like probably eventually another NESCAC school, or some years it would be University of Rochester or Case Western Reserve, because in Division III, you kind of have to clear everybody within your 500-mile radius before you get a chance to go to the Final Four. So, those are the teams that stand in Keene State's way. Keene State obviously did not get nearly that far into the tournament last year, but they did get to the round of 16, which is a good step for that program, and usually portends a chance to really be a Final Four contender. It's not often that a team comes from nowhere, like not having won a tournament game or not having even gotten into the tournament, and gets all the way to the Final Four. Keene State is absolutely one of those programs that has all of the leading indicators to suggest that they could do it this year.
Yeah, and one more team that I do want to hit on. We mentioned them a little bit earlier, but Calvin, your thoughts on Calvin right now, because they've played pretty consistently. They just dropped down to number 12. They're outside of that top 10, but do they have the capability to be a national championship contender?
I mean, I certainly think so. They've been a little up and down, right? They looked great in the Great Lakes Invitational back in November. They handled UW La Crosse. Then, they lost at Trine to UW Platteville by 22 points. It's really interesting, right? Man, Jalen Overway is amazing. Uchenna Igekezi is a guy who, everybody's talked about. They struggled in their rivalry game against Hope this past week without, I had the name and I lost it, so I need to go back and kind of check my notes here. But they were missing one of their key guys in Owen Varnado, who is not available for the game. He's a guy who's a double-double kind of guy for them most nights, and they really struggled at Hope in front of an arch rivalry number of fans and 3,186 fans at the DeVos Center in Holland, Michigan. So, it'd be interesting. Calvin certainly has the potential. Trine is also really good in that conference, obviously, and Calvin lost at home to Trine. So, the top of the MIAA is really good. When you're talking about a team that is pretty good as Hope is this year, they're 14-6 going into Saturday. They're just 6-3 in the conference, and they're third place in the conference. So that's because Trine is 19-1 and Calvin is 17-3. So, I think interesting to see. I'm not sure that I would be putting. I would still look at Calvin in more for 2025. And I know eventually, you lose Uchenna and that sort of thing, but I think that's a program that maybe is not quite this year. I know that, excuse me, I know that there are a lot of people who follow Calvin in the Division III basketball know. There's a whole podcast, the D3 Datacast, which I definitely recommend people tuning into if you're very interested in, just number crunching and regional rankings and that sort of thing. Those guys both went to Calvin, so I know I have to reference that out loud. I am not ignorant of what I'm saying in front of what audience I might be saying it in front of. I'm not sure that this is Calvin's year, but they definitely, if they can put it together for the 3 weekends that it requires, obviously they have the individual talent to be able to do so.
And that's the great part of this time of year is like we're talking about teams that are hot, teams that are going to stay hot, teams that might get hot at the right time. And it really comes down to that chemistry that we talked about at the beginning, but also that individual talent. And Small College Basketball just released our Bevo Francis Award. The top 100 watch list was just announced. So I'm going to throw some names at you.
All right.
And I want you to see, I want to get your feedback. We already talked about, Brito and, the Keene State duo, but I do want to get to Brody Fox.
All right. So here is where you get me as the guy who is half football, half basketball. So you are going to have to give me a little more information here.
Brody Fox is Wisconsin Talbot, and he's leading the country in scoring, 28 points per game.
All right. So obviously, since I did not have UW Stout on the top tip of my tongue, I don't have a specific on this guy. I do know that Stout has that Stout has knocked off a couple of teams that you wouldn't necessarily expect them to, right? They won at home against Whitewater a couple of weeks ago.
Yep.
And that's a big dang deal. And I'm looking forward to I'll actually be able to see them in person a week from when this podcast drops. Stout goes to Eau Claire. Eau Claire has it's a big rivalry. It's the war on I-94. They're just maybe about 30 miles apart or so. And Eau Claire is in its last season. It's in its kind of classic old gymnasium, Zorn Arena. So I'm going out to that game to get that in person. So I don't know now. Ask me again in a week.
Sounds good. How about from Case Western Reserve, popular team that we've talked about, Anthony Mazzeo?
Yeah. I mean, that's the guy I was talking about, right? He's the guy from Baldwin Wallace. He is a scoring machine. He's really difficult to guard. Good free throw shooter. Like I said, we had him out at our tournament, and sometimes it's difficult. We play this tournament in Las Vegas, not in a ballroom, not in a Division III gym, but in an arena that's kind of like something you'd see in the Big West, something at a low D1 level. And sometimes guys come in who play in smaller gyms like Case Western Reserve does, and you kind of struggle to shoot against the bigger, the deeper sight lines and, the 4,000 seats and that sort of thing. Did not bother this guy. He's definitely a guy who's on the short list for some awards from our organization as well.
20 points per game, shooting 40% from three.
Yep.
So a couple of names to watch there. We've mentioned a few so far, and I want to be respectful of your time. We're doing this in advance of the weekend, so it's a little bit crazy for everybody with families and weather and coaching and jobs. But last couple of questions, Pat. The timeline for Division III coming down the stretch of the season. What can we expect to see in terms of, scheduling, regional tournaments, conference tournaments, and then what do you think happens as we get to the rankings?
Yeah, so we will have we'll have an alphabetical set of regional rankings, which I firmly don't see the value of, or there is value to it, but we shouldn't be replacing one of our regular 1 through 10 or 1 through whatever in the region with something that's alphabetical and kind of useless to the fan. We should have gotten that alphabetical ranking on January 31st, but we won't get it till February 7th. And then we'll have 2 rankings on the 14th and the 21st that will give you some indication at least of where you might stand if you are an at-large team. Obviously, in Division III, there's more than 40 automatic bids to the field of 64. So, 2/3 fully of the Division III bracket is made up of teams that win their conferences, and you are fighting for one of 22 at-large bids. So you want to be the best at-large team in your region if you end up in the at-large pot, which is called Pool C in Division III parlance. So that's what that regional ranking is good for. And then, of course, conference tournaments will generally be in full force from about the 18th of February through the 25th. The 25th is, the 26th is Selection Monday. Selection Sunday is not really a thing in Division III basketball anymore because so many conferences play their tournament championship games on Sunday that they can't put together a reasonable bracket in a reasonable time frame for Sunday night. So we find out on Monday afternoon where everybody's going, and then games are on in the NCAA tournament are on the 1st and 2nd, the 8th and 9th, and then the 14th and the 16th, Thursday and Saturday for the semifinals and the national championship, which will once again be in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So that's what things look like kind of from here on out.
Well, Pat, the knowledge that you bring to the podcast from the Division III side is always valuable. I had the opportunity to talk about a handful of teams, handful of players, getting exciting this time of year to watch, what happens down the stretch. And I guess the last question for you, I always try to end this with a quick hitter, but your passion for Division III, where'd it come from?
Well, I went to a Division III school, and I grew up in Minnesota, where there's actually a pretty robust Division III atmosphere. So around here and I live here now. So around here, those schools are like St. John's, used to be St. Thomas, like Hamlin, Augsburg, Concordia, Moorhead, that sort of thing. And they were a big deal when I was growing up here in the 80s. They received regular news coverage. The rivalry games were well attended, etc. I went to a D3 school at Catholic University of America in DC. And then I was the sports information director for a short time after graduation. And, basically, fighting for column inches in the Washington Post, which styles itself as a national newspaper and is in a market where there are 4 pro sports teams and 5 Division I schools. It was really difficult to get even Catholic, which was the best Division III program in DC, and still is, by the way. Any attention in the paper, and then to try to find any national coverage of Division III to try to bring some perspective to what I was trying to pitch Catholic as was basically impossible. And this is like the mid-90s. So I had the opportunity to take over an existing Division III basketball website in the fall of 1997, and I figured it would be something to do for like a night or two a week, a couple hours a night. And it would be more updated than it was before, and everybody would be happy. It turns out that there's a rabid Division III basketball fan community and a lot of sports information directors in the late 90s willing to provide information to us, and it turned into something that I did 20, 30 hours a week. But basically, it just kind of all evolves around Division III being, this kind of pure bastion of, the last amateurs. There was this book written by John
Yeah.
Feinstein about the Patriot League. Give me a break. That's what NCAA Division III actually is. This is where that pure form of basketball and other sports are being played. It is as it was when the NCAA was founded. And you can still see that at Division III. And it's a quality product. It's entertaining. It's easy to attend. It's cheap. It's a great way to entertain your family. And that is my pitch for NCAA Division III athletics.
Well, Pat, that's terrific. That's why we love small college basketball so much. It's that purity and that joy with which, the coaches coach and the players play. So once again, thank you for your time. We enjoyed it. It's always great to have you on, and glad to have you drop some knowledge on NCAA Division III men's basketball.
Next time I'll have my Brody Fox stuff queued up for you.
There you go. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you.